The Bookends, we are back, and this time with a little bit more interesting period. If you remember, we did 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, and here we are 90 to 2000. This is going to be a little bit different and a little bit more interesting, I think, because things are getting a little bit more contentious. After the 90s, a lot of things happened. If you remember, I made a video about the cliche of the 90s being terrible for metal, and then grunge came and all of that, and I kind of countered that, and I made the point that it was mostly the established metal bands' fault to give in to this tendency. And it's pretty evident, of course, the internet happened, the influence of journalists, which was always there, but in the late 80s, early 90s, they became much more contentious and aggressive and violent and putting their own ideas and biases in there. They became very condescending and dismissive of anything that they didn't like. It wasn't up to the vogues of the time. But let's just dive into it. And I want to start with AC/DC. We did have an album in 90, great album, of course, The Razor's Edge, and of course, one in 2000, Stiff Upper Lip, which of course the public took to pretty well. I personally didn't like it that much, but again, it's AC/DC. So what I do like about AC/DC and a few other bands like them, Motorhead, that they just marched through the 90s like nothing happened. So they didn't look left and right. They didn't give into the industrial grunge, you name it, any kind of these fads. So they just went ahead and marched on and did their thing. So since we mentioned Motorhead, we will also mention Motorhead had no album in 90. They had a pretty weak one in the late 80s, 88 or 87 or so, Another Perfect Day, which I wasn't a big fan of. Then in 91, they had 1916, which is also not among their best. Not terrible by any means, but definitely not among their best. In 2000, they kind of come with We Are Motorhead, which was, I think, as far as the period goes, their peak period, the mid late 90s to the 2010s was just amazing what they did there. They went in much more, I would say, focused and sober and straightforward, and they just banged out some of their best ever albums. Despite that, We Are Motorhead from this period, yeah, although it belongs there, it's kind of starting to be among the less good among those. Overnight Sensation came out, I think, in '96 is their best, along with Hammer 2002. So there you go. Another band like that mentions that deserves an honorable mention is Saxon. Even though I'm not so familiar with Saxon, and I never been a huge fan, but I have a ton of respect for these guys because they just like Motorhead, they marched on and in the studio bang out album after album, even though they never got really to the top tier of the big success. Right, so Saxon is kind of, you have to be a metalhead to be real familiar with them. Did they have an album in 90? I don't think so. They have one in 89 and perhaps 91, but not 90 per se. But again, pretty much like Motorhead, not a huge difference, not a huge change between their albums. And then in 2000 they released Unleash the Beast, which was a nice, very straightforward heavy metal album. No, again, no nod and no, definitely no sellouts, but no mention or no trace of grunge and industrial and so on and so forth. So these are the good ones. Those that were not so good, Maiden, again in '90, people didn't take what you know, Prayer for the Dying. I personally kind of grew on to me, and I do appreciate it. It's better than its reputation, at least in my mind. It's different, and I always say that it's bears some semblance to Point of Entry, Priest's Point of Entry, which is sandwiched between two very great, very successful albums, British Steel and Screaming for Vengeance, and in the middle they sandwich this kind of stripped down, trying to be simplistic, similar idea with Maiden, right? Between Seventh Son and Fear of the Dark, you have this kind of stripped down and trying to be more straightforward. 2000, they come out with Brave New World, which Maiden fans love across the board for the most part. I personally don't like it. It's my least favorite Maiden record, even including even Blaze Bailey's record. Interestingly, but I'm not gonna say that it's terrible. It's just to me, it's not Maiden-ish. It has the production is muddy. Maybe it was a little bit of a nod to the grunge thing. Maybe those with Bailey, they definitely didn't sell out, but they might have made a nod to it. But again, they were going through a dark period, both as a band and personally. So again, No Prayer versus Brave New World, Judas Priest, of course, 1990, Painkiller. They just came out and show everybody how to do it. Amazing record, but right afterwards, unfortunate things started to go downhill from for them as a band. I blame most of their management, which was not only inept but willfully sabotaging them. At least one element in their management, which is very sad. No album in 2000 per se. 2002 they come with Demolition, which is pretty much a piece of crap, at least from a priest standpoint. At least it's not as bad as Circulator. But let's move on from that. Let's take a look at some other big old bands. Let's take a look at the Deep Purple family. Deep Purple family. Deep Purple, of course, Rainbow wasn't around anymore for a good while. Blackmore did try reviving it. Well, actually, didn't just try. It did revive it for a short period in the mid '90s, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, Purple, Slaves and Masters, a universally hated record, which I like very, very much. I think that they just unleashed and they're the most carelessly creative. In other words, they didn't want to cater to anyone. They didn't look at success. They just did what they wanted, and it sounds like it's very quirky but very good. Of course, as usually, they shine all of them. Lord, Blackmore, Glover, Picey, of course, and Gillan wasn't there. Okay, I'm not a big fan of Jolene Turner, so that didn't bode well for the album. But if the album didn't have JLT, I think it would have come out much better. But again, the clash between Blackmore and Gillan would have probably prevented it. But again, so um, overall, at least commercially speaking, was kind of a lackluster album. Didn't go too well for them. 2000, we were talking about a post Blackmore period. No album in 2000 per se. The closest would be Bananas in 2003, which I love very much. I don't know what the public perception or acceptance of it was, but to me, it always kind of gave a little bit underneath the surface some burn and a little bit of Stormbringer. Maybe actually more Stormbringer vibes. Gave me kind of that vibe. Has some bluesy stuff on there. Real great album. But again, they also didn't look left or right into the grunge thing. Whitesnake, no album in '90 that kind of went down after the big success of 1987. The unfortunate hit a snag there. The public didn't like Slip of the Tongue whatsoever. I loved it. In my opinion, this is Vi's among his best work, if not the best. But and commercially, it was still big. They were still big, but they were not as successful as '87. And then subsequently, the fans turned on them because of Slip of the Tongue. Go figure. And the tour was very successful. But then they going into kind of a hibernation. There's no Whitesnake. DC releases one solo album as Whitesnake in '97. Not the greatest. Has three or four amazing songs and a good production. Danny Carmassi does a great job on it, but still kind of a lackluster album. And then in 2000, he releases only a solo album under his own name, which is a soundtrack or partially a soundtrack. Not bad, but again, at this point, Whitesnake is still in a hibernating nature, as well as Rainbow, which comes out for one album, falls apart, and then Blackmore does Blackmore's Night with his girlfriend, and they release a couple records. 2000, so of course that started in '97, I think, the first one. The first three were just amazing, amazing records, and by 2005 at midnight, they already kind of after their peak, or at least not one of their best records. Not bad at all, and I think that Blackmore's Night is very, very largely responsible for all of the folk revival that happened approximately a decade later. So in the 2010s, when all kind of bands like Santiano and bands in the vein of the Pogues, even though they've been around, Flogging Molly, things like that. The folk element came out very strongly. I think that Blackmore was very instrumental in that. Other big old bands, Black Sabbath, of course, comes out with Tire in 1990, which is generally not considered among their best work, although it's a great album in my opinion. They did a great job, all of them there. You got Tony Martin, which has a very weird stage persona. Doesn't really work well, not with Sabbath, and I don't think with any other band. To be honest with you, but he's a good guy, good vocalist, good lyricist, and I'm actually a big fan of Tyre. But by 2000, he already did the two other records in the mid 90s, 94, 95, which I didn't like at all, didn't care for them. And they again kind of did the reunion thing, and they were in hibernation, as we know, until 2013, I think, when they did 13. Uriah Heep, pretty similar story. They released one in, I think, in 89 and 91. Pretty good, solid Heep records. Also, they don't look left and right. They don't look at the fans. They just go ahead with their own thing. And there's no grunge or industrial or any kind of stuff like that. They already understood that they're veterans. They're never going to appeal to the 14, 15, 16 years old who are chasing the fads and the fashions. And they did it good albums. I think it was Sonic Origami and Sea of Light. No, Sea of Light was mid 90s, very good, among the better records. And then of course they went into a long hibernation from 98. I think that was Sonic Origami, if I'm not mistaken, until 2008. Wake the Sleeper, kind of aptly named. Blue Oyster Cult, unfortunately similar situation after Imagine Us in 89, or was it 88? Great album, but they go kind of on tour forever without a record deal until the late 90s, when they first released Heaven Forbid and then Curse of the Hidden Mirror in 2001, I think, or 2000 itself. Again, closing the decade on a high note, and then Curse of the Hidden Mirror was, of course, already in the 2000s, and people who listened to those bigger bands, they expected another classic, which of course it wasn't. It wasn't Tyranny and Mutation and Secret Trees all over again, but very nice, solid record. So I don't see a big problem with it. Rush, similar kind of situation. They had one in 89 and 91, Presto and Roll the Bone, which was the big change, the big flip with Roll the Bones. They scaled back and made a much more stripped down sound. And I think it worked out quite well, but I wasn't a huge fan of that. I'm not sure how much the grunge thing influenced that, but they didn't sell out. They didn't go all the way to that. In '96, they released Echoes, which one of my one of my all-time favorites, and then around 2000, Vapor Trail, which I wasn't a huge fan of, but again, another solid Rush album. So this is where we are, kind of an experimental period. Ozzy, 1991, No More Tears. 2000, he has a record that's called Down to Earth, which I think was kind of muddy and not well done, not well produced. Again, it could be chalked up to the influence of the period, but maybe it was something else. Wasp, great band who also just marched on just like Motorhead. Actually, they did have one record where they kind of nodded towards the very industrial. That's an angry record full of piss and vinegar. Him and Chris Holmes were both very angry, went through some tough personal stuff. That record's called Kill Fuck Die in 97, but that's the only one that kind of sounds like that. All of the others, again, there's no album in 1990. They have The Headless Children in 89, with which they kind of found favor with journalists because they abandoned most of their smut, and they made some pretend serious topics, right? The nuclear war and Reagan wanting to burn down the world. So they did this, and it worked well for them. And then in '92 they do that very pretentious rock opera, The Eternal Idol, which again, great, very good record, and very straight ahead heavy metal. So no nods yet to the incoming feds. And then in 2000, I don't think they have a record per se, but they started at Eldorado in '99. Very good. Already there was kind of ushering in the retro mentality, and the retro I just say movement or tendency. In 2000, either two or one, they released Unholy Terror. Very good, straight hard banging heavy metal album. All of the mistakes that they made in Eldorado, they fixed on this one. So kudos to Wasp. And then we have kind of Europe, Germany, where sort of, I wouldn't say completely under the radar, but less flashy, less in the limelight. We had still the dominance of the speed metal that kind of came out in the late 80s, right? Halloween and all of their offshoots and similar bands, Gamma Ray, Edge Guy, Dragon Force, all kind of bands like that. They went kind of strong and pretty hard, and they had their own audience. They were relatively big, not super big, but they were big enough. Except I'm not familiar enough with the band to know what they did. But as far as I know, they never sold out. So um, that was a situation. I think that Halloween had albums in on around '90 and 2000, and they kind of continued in a pretty much similar way. And then of course the new, even the post grunge stuff already started kicking in, right? In the from the mid to the late '90s, we had all of these bands. What are they called already? God's Lamb, Smack of Dog, Smack of God, Dark, not Darkness, but David Damian, Darmian, Dramian, the guy who did the cover of Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, and managed to make it worse than the original. Disturbed, yeah, that's the name of the band, Disturbed. Then you have Nine Inch Nails, Rage for the Establishment, which maybe officially weren't considered grunge, but it was pretty much the same mentality. But these bands were kind of sort of coming away from the grunge movement and kind of making their own thing. It wasn't yet a full 180, full return to tradition as would become in the next decade, but it already showed the tendency. And you had, of course, Popcorn and Roach's Papa and all of these kind of Five Death Finger, Avenged Sevenfold, all of these things. One thing that's kind of interesting, that the bands that really got on a lot of people's nerves, especially the journalists, so the big flashy makeup-y smutty bands, the Motley Crue when they're Offspring, Rat and Quiet Riot and Poison, all of these that kind of got really big, they faded away real fast. So the backlash against that, what started with, I think, Guns N' Roses. Oh, here's another one, Love Hate, which I always remember with Guns N' Roses. Don't know what happened to that band, but I think they had an album out in '90 or '91 or maybe '89. Very good record, very similar to Guns N' Roses, but you could make the case that it's even better. So anyway, that was pretty much the situation. But the good part of the '80s, right? So whatever wasn't Motley Crue and Twisted Sister and Poison and such, there came a lot of good bands out of it. You had Dokken, you had Warren, you had Winger, Great White, Tesla. Most of these didn't survive. Great White and Tesla kind of continued, and they remained also not in the super limelight, but they marched and soldiered on. And as far as I know, they never went out to the grunge way, so they held onto their guns, and they made a. You could make the case that it was some sort of a captive tradition, or the more traditional style of hard rock and heavy metal. Um, so that's pretty much it. '90 to 2000, a lot of interesting things happened. A lot of elements other than the musicians from the business are injecting themselves and flexing their muscle and exerting their influence, and the response of the public, let's just say the general public, was to go along with it. But again, they turned their back on it relatively fast. So the fad, the big grunge and so-called alternative fad faded away pretty fast, much faster than the madness of heavy metal, which subsequently came back. So there we are again. Interesting decade of turmoil where the big old bands are kind of starting to get old and tired, and the gaps between the time lapse between records is growing and becoming bigger, and the material is not like knocking you off your knocking your socks off, but still very good and solid. And then you have the newcomers who go in different directions and quite in a big way coming back to tradition. I think I should have also mentioned bands like, let's just say, Tool and Meshuggah, for example, that a lot of people try to talk me into. Interesting stuff, but somehow it doesn't really talk to me. Like people always tell me, "Oh, Tool, listen, it's just like a revamped King Crimson," which is, I can see that, I can listen to it a little bit, but to me, it lacks the life. Let's just say that moistness, that freshness, that youthness that King Crimson always brought, even if they're later iteration, right? So Tool is always like, to me, sounds a little bit too clinical, too polished, too clean cut. Same thing with kind of Meshuggah. Like, it's more like a physics class or a mathematics class than actual art and entertainment. But who knows? I may just do another one from 2000 to 2010. And in the meantime, don't forget to keep rocking on and on and on and on